Perdóname porque mi español no es bueno, puesto con permisión. Hablo en inglés. We have a translation for those who might need it. So muchas gracias, Blanca, for translating. I'm Andy Furco from the University of Minnesota, and I'm very honored to be invited to be part of your conference. I've appreciated being back here at UDEM. I spent several years serving with the Student Affairs Office International Advisory Board with Dr. Alicia Canton and Dr. Isabella Navarro and Leticia Lopez, and I want to thank them for inviting me, and also for Nelda for her hospitality over these last couple days, picking me up at the airport and all those wonderful things that I really appreciated. And it's just really wonderful to see all the growth of service learning and the enthusiasm that's happening at UDEM and across Mexico and beyond. Indeed, service learning is continuing to expand and grow across the globe. As those of you who participated in the earlier workshop learned about some of the efforts happening across the globe. Just this year alone, I've participated in service learning conferences in Hong Kong and Singapore, in Japan and in Europe. This week alone, there's one happening in South Africa. There's a wonderful conference, the 22nd annual Service Learning Conference in Buenos Aires in August, and last month there was one in Belgium and one in Germany, and in the United States we had more than 20 service learning conferences in different parts of the U.S. So there's a lot of service learning happening across the globe, and it is truly a global phenomenon. And there are many things that, while there are many important distinctions that I think we have heard from our students here today and throughout these last couple of days, as there are important distinctions, there are also some commonalities. And one of the commonalities that I'd like to talk with you about today is the issue of the challenge in assessing student learning in service learning. And as we heard, the students learn many things from service learning, but how as professors do we assess the learning in service learning? And this is a big challenge that all of us are facing who do this work. And quite honestly, we have not done a very good work in assessing service learning fully and comprehensively. A lot of what we've done around service learning has been, in terms of assessment, has been very superficial. It has been very incomplete, and oftentimes it's very ad hoc. And, we say, we have to do some assessment. So we put something together to try to, some instrument or some assessment, and we try to measure that learning. And that's really quite inadequate and unsatisfactory. And so what I want to talk with you about today is perhaps some framings and some ways that we can approach the assessment process. There's no one way to assess service learning, just because service learning is so very different in different contexts. And so, I often get asked, can you give me a tool to assess service learning? And I said, I can give you lots of tools, depending on what it is that you want to assess, given that there's so many different outcomes that we expect and often want from service learning. So what I want to be able to provide is just some framings for us to really think about as we approach the assessment process. What are some things we should be thinking about? And then I also like to walk through a couple of examples and maybe get your ideas as well. So in general, assessment is a very complicated phenomenon. There are lots of books on assessing student learning, and there is no one way to do it. And it does vary a lot based on the content, based on the discipline, based on the level of the student, based on a lot of factors. And we also want to measure a lot of things. We want to measure student knowledge. We want to measure their skills, their performance in a particular point in time, or we want to measure how they grow over time. There's lots of different things that we want to do. And so some of the characteristics of assessment that need to be addressed, need to be thought about before we delve into how it applies to service learning. So we know that some learning for student learning can be observed. And so a lot of assessments are about observing that learning, and we usually do that through examinations where students demonstrate their learning, or through some kind of performance or project that students produce. But also we do a lot of assessment that's more indirect, where students report what they have learned or report what they have experienced. Whether or not we observed it ourselves as professors, it may not be the case. So we take students' presentation of their learning as what we determine to be the assessment. So the typical ways that we assess in general, or assess service learning, that we often see are in looking at, is often very formal. So we have a service learning project, service learning experience, and we give student an examination that's tied to the course content. And we expect the service learning to have contributed to that learning. And we often see that as an important thing, either to write a paper or an essay, something very formal that students are asked to assess, to demonstrate their learning as an assessment tool. We also often make the assessments high stakes, where students' grades are dependent on it. So we grade these assessments, and so they become high stakes. High stakes, that makes sense? Yes. Mostly our assessments tend to be very summative, meaning that we do them at the end of the experience, or we do it when something has been completed, as opposed to doing assessments that are more formative. As students are experiencing their learning, we check in to see whether or not they are learning some things. So we tend to rely more on summative ones. We tend to also time them or give them deadlines. Your paper is due in 1 week, or you have 2 hours to complete this exam, or you have to have this paper done by this time. So we put a lot of time limits. And we know that the thought process and the development, when we think about service learning, as we heard here, may take months, sometimes beyond the service learning experience. And so we lose a lot of the potential learning because of the kinds of assessments that we tend to give. We also tend to give more individual assessments. And we know that a lot of service learning is group work, and there's teamwork and collaboration. And those are not the kinds of assessments that we tend to give to students. And mostly knowledge-based. What do students know? We tend to want to assess learning in terms of what students know, rather than assessing skills or assessing changes in attitudes or changes in perspectives. We tend to want to look at what they know in terms of content. Right? So these are the popular ways that we tend to assess that are often inadequate for what we try to do. And these formal assessments basically are oftentimes done separately from service learning. So we do the service learning experience, and then we give these assessments. And they tend to also be just inadequate because we tend to apply standardized mechanisms. When we try to look deeper into service learning experiences, we tend to pull items off the shelf that others have used and say, oh, this is a service learning assessment tool. We're going to apply it. But that assessment tool hasn't been designed for the particular context or the particular student. But yet we use it to measure. And I've seen a lot of assessments where professors will do pre and post tests of students on civic attitudes or multicultural understanding that have been designed with specific purposes and particular populations in mind, without really understanding that perhaps it might not be appropriate for that. So how do we go about this? I think what's very important has to do with how we look at service learning as a pedagogy. And I know that here at UDEM and in other places you have a more sophisticated understanding of service learning than in a lot of places. And what we oftentimes see is the learning component, the blue sphere here, and this red sphere of service. And we say, okay, we want to do service learning. We have our course, our class, with the learning objectives, And then we say we want to tie some service to it. And so we're going to connect these things. And we say that's service learning. We have the information, the content, the learning that we do in the classroom, and then we have the students go out to have an experience. And our assessment tends to focus a lot on the blue area and not so much on what's happening in the red area. We may ask students for their opinions, to reflect, maybe to share their stories, their experience, but we don't assess the learning that happens in that red sphere often. And what we have to remember for service learning, that this is not accurate of what service learning is. What service learning really is the learning, this blue learning and this red service coming together to really become a very different kind of experience, which is really a purple experience where the two are blended together. Because what happens in the classroom helps students do a better service in the community because they have more knowledge and understanding of specific things. And what happens in the community helps students provide a better service and help students learn the content better and interpret the content better, because now they have this experience where they've applied and they've integrated that learning into something that's authentic and real. So these two things are very inextricably linked. So it's really a very different experience than those two things just touching each other. So how do we go about assessing this? What are the assessments that we need to consider to do a comprehensive assessment? And so one of the frames that we'd like to use for assessing service learning to think about it is that we need to think about the following. First of all, we have to look at what is the content of the course. This is the content-based experience. Whatever the academic course content might be, we have to think about assessing those learning objectives. And those we would do with the normal things that we would do in our courses. Okay, and I'm looking at this from a faculty, a teacher perspective. Okay. But we also know that students have these experiences in the community, and we ask them to go into the community and perform some work, some service. And the students, when we send them to the community, may not have the skills or the knowledge or the experience to do that work. And that work may be very different from what the content of the course is. So, and I'll give you an example. We'll walk through an example. But students now are learning a whole set of skills, some new knowledge, getting some different experiences that are different from the learning from the course content, academic content. So there are new learnings now. And so we have to think about how we are going to assess those if we're going to do a comprehensive assessment. And then the other thing that service learning is doing in terms of student experience is that students are also learning about a societal issue. That the goal is not just to feed the homeless. The goal is to understand, to do real deep service learning, to do service learning, is to be able to say, why do we have homeless people? Who becomes homeless? Why is it that we have a neighborhood here that has all of these affluence, and yet here we have this poverty and these homeless folks, right? That's understanding the societal issue that makes this service learning. And so students are gaining knowledge and understanding of a societal issue. And so if we're going to do an assessment, we have to understand we have to assess that. Okay? Is that making sense? So the learning of the content and the learning of the societal issue really is part of the academic achievement piece, the real academic part of this. And then the work that we do in the community and the work that we're learning about the societal issue are about the civic or the community responsibility, social responsibility aspects of this work. And these are the two main outcomes of service learning: academic outcomes and civic or social responsibility outcomes. Okay? And this is what makes it service learning. And really that part in the middle, the societal part, is really the hyphen. It's really what brings the learning and the service together. It's addressing that societal issue, getting underneath all of these issues, why we have these conditions in our society. Okay, so let's walk through an example of how we would go about doing an assessment, right? And I'd like to give you an example. So one of the examples from my university is the cultures of Native Americans. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about this. This is a course that has studies in American cultures, American Indian studies, and this is studies various issues as students learn about the plight and cultures of Native American Indians in North America. And the students study the history of the Ojibwe tribe. We have many tribes in the U.S., in Canada, and also here in Mexico. And so the students in particular, one of the areas is studying the Ojibwe tribe, which is found in my state, Minnesota, and understanding its cultural practices. And they study the history of the Ojibwe people. The students learn about the Ojibwe language, and they learn that this language is being endangered in terms of extinction. And a little bit about the language. The Ojibwe language is spoken by about 200,000 Ojibwe people who reside in the United States and Canada. And the Ojibwe country primarily extends, you may know, from Quebec to Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Canada, and then in the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota in the United States. And there's not a single standard language, but a chain of very linked local varieties grouped into nearly about a dozen dialects. And so each dialect, and within each dialect, there are local varieties based on where in North America these individuals and groups reside. And they have differences in pronunciation, in vocabulary, grammar, and with differences between non-adjacent dialects often being great enough to impede understanding between Ojibwean speakers. So it is an endangered language. Fewer and fewer people are speaking the language. And so, and this is true of a lot of indigenous languages across the Americas. And so, as you may know, in 1879, the United States established off-reservation federal boarding schools to re-educate Indian children and youth in the English language and American ways of life. And so in what this course wanted to do was find a way to explore how we might preserve the language and keep it from being extinct. And so the students and the faculty member, the students and the faculty member decide to create a project to help preserve the language by developing an oral dictionary. So this is a dictionary where you would have the word and its meaning, Ojibwe word and its meaning, and hearing the sound from all the different dialects that speak that word as a way to preserve the language. So this is an oral dictionary. So these are students who are taking this course, and the dictionary, the dictionary is going to record the Ojibwe words, provide definitions, along with their historical significance and etymology. And then the students develop this program where they meet elderly native Ojibwe speakers, whereupon the students facilitate systematic recording. So they track all the recordings in a very systematic and cataloged way for the pronunciation list of words, and they also collect stories and historical information about the members of the Ojibwe community. And then the students work with linguists who provide phonetics for the words and help organize the dictionary, which has been developed over several semesters. So this is each group of students who takes this course each semester contributes to this project. So this is the context. So how does that frame that I mentioned earlier apply? So let's look at, I don't know where to point this. There we go. So the first is learning the content. So what are the students learning in this course in terms of the content of the course? This would be what the students would naturally learn if we didn't have the service piece to it, if they weren't doing this dictionary, right? They would learn about the differences in cultures and customs, communities that are defined by early populations of North America. This is what normally they would learn, that are in the U.S., Canadian, Mexican territories, and students learn about how some native languages, such as Ojibwe, are being extinct. That's what they would learn. And that's what normally would be part of the assessment. Okay, and we'll talk about what that assessment looks like in just a moment. Then in terms of learning about the service, so now the students have to go produce this dictionary. They have to go and interview elderly individuals who speak Ojibwe. And many of them have not had that experience before. So now they're learning all these skills, and they're learning all of these things that are not necessarily part of the content of the course, but are part of the service learning experience, that purple sphere. That we also have to think about, this is a learning outcome for students, and therefore we need to think about how we're going to assess whether or not the students have learned that. So what might the students learn about this? They learn how to greet and engage with members of the Ojibwe community. They learn how to document and code language, which they may not have done otherwise. They need to learn how to be respectful, certain customs in the Ojibwe culture, native culture, elicit members for their full participation, and be able to know how to organize these data and these information that can go into a dictionary. Right? Again, these are skills and knowledge and experiences that students are learning that are not necessarily part of the content of the course normally. Again, this is part of the enhanced learning experience that service learning provides. And then about the societal issue. And so students are learning about the fate of extinction of languages, how they are not used, how they might be preserved or not being preserved, and that really thinking about the whole trajectory of this and what this means for the native peoples and the Ojibways in particular. So they're getting into the societal issue and what are the implications of colonization. I mean, it gets very complicated. So this is what service learning provides in terms of a whole spectrum of learning that would not be part of this experience if the service component was not embedded in this course. Right? So you see how service learning actually expands the learning outcomes and objectives of the course. So now we have to think about how we go about assessing this. So this is where you come in. So learning the content of the course. The learning objectives, this is what the academic course would be about. What are some ways you would go about assessing whether students have learned about the different cultures, the languages, communities that define the populations of North America that currently comprise Canadian and U.S. and Mexican territories? What might be some ways you might do this? This is the regular content of the course. What are some assessments? Alicia. I think we need the microphone, see? Blanca, we need the microphone? It's, I think for the translator, and she can. That's easy. I can repeat it, Alicia, if you like.
If they can name the cultures, the geographic location of those cultures, how long their history, some of their customs and traditions, if they can describe them, name them and describe them, and be able to compare them.
Okay.
to their own, for example.
Excellent, excellent. So would you use what? A test? Would you, what would the assessment be? The process?
It could be a test, it could be a discussion board, it could be a drawing or some kind of composition that has different elements in it.
Okay.
So they can describe the culture using graphics or using...
So it could be formal, a formal
Yeah.
test, or it could be more informal,
Mhm.
just feedback that you might then do some kind of a check of where students are.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else? Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything? So this is fairly typical, right, of what we would do in a classroom. Okay. So let's make it a little more challenging. Let's move on to the next part. So, let's see. So, here's some suggestions. So we can have an examination. We can ask the students to write a paper that compares the cultures, as actually Alicia was suggesting, different Native American communities, or participation in class discussions, something more informal, okay? So this would be some ways we might do that. So now, how might we assess this service piece where the students now are working on this dictionary, where they're greeting and engaging with members of the Ojibwe community, and they're learning how to do that and do it well, because it's the quality of the service that matters. So if they're not approaching the Ojibwe community members in a respectful way or in an appropriate way, they're not going to, the Ojibwe community members are not going to open up. They're not going to want to participate, right? How to connect and code the language, which is not something I think most students would know how to do who take this class. And how to organize a spoken dictionary. How many of us know how to do that? So here are some learnings that the students now are achieving. How might we assess these things as a professor or teacher? Yes, sir.
I believe that everyone hears me.
Microphone, por favor, gracias.
If my public is young students, what I will do for them is that they make a rap of the language.
A rap.
A rap.
A rap song?
To make it more interactive, but put in some of that elements in order for them to rap the song, but understand the meaning of the rap song. That
So-
could be something different.
Very good. How would you then assess whether the students have learned this or not?
Excellent. When one thing is rapping, and that the song sound cool, but other thing is that the rap have a meaning. And but having a meaning, they need to understand the language, the roots of the language, and the connection of the words. So that could be some way of evaluating the rap. One is how good it sounds. Another thing is if they know all the root, the meaning, and all the codes that at the end of the song will make it sound beautiful.
Yeah. Excellent. That's wonderful. So this is a student's demonstration of that they indeed have learned it by demonstrating through a performance, right? That would have certain criteria, scaffolding, that they have to meet certain standards or certain things have to be included. How else might we assess this? Okay, Alicia. Gracias. Oh.
Well, a very basic first assessment for me would be how many people have they met? If they are not being welcomed, or if they have one interview or two and they're supposed to have 6 or 8, that will tell me that they're having some problems engaging with the community. It's like a very basic indicator that they're having challenges to meet with them. And then if I wanted to know how they're doing or moving along with the dictionary, how many recordings, how many words, how are these videos or these audio tapes describing the number of words that are being listed.
Mm-hmm.
It continues to be very basic, talking about counting. That's why, but it's still something that lets you know if students are being able to engage in the community or not.
Okay, so are you assessing, that's great, are you assessing the experience or you're assessing the learning?
No, first, if they're able to come into the community, not necessarily more deep and complex things, just as indicators of, yes, they have appointments, they're moving into meeting people, how many people.
And so you're using that as a proxy
Mm-hmm.
for student learning.
As a very basic one, but yes, because that will tell me if they are able to connect and if the interviews went well or no.
Okay.
Another thing maybe it would be to ask them to have transcripts of those conversations or those words, and have them identify or color in different ways the words, and then in another level maybe I would ask them to tell me what they discovered, what called their attention, how they felt when talking to those people, and going into more personal experiences of the students.
Okay. So yeah, now we're getting more into the learning piece. So these transcripts, the students could circle the words that perhaps have certain shadings and meanings that are different across the different dialects, for example, as a way to begin to build that dictionary. So now we're getting into having students demonstrate that they understand and they've learned. Other suggestions? This gets more complicated, right? Because now this is outside of our regular formal kinds of assessments. Yes, in the back, please. Gracias.
Ahorita, bueno, in Spanish, please.
Sí, no problema.
Retomando un poco lo que decía Jesús, de un rap. Bueno, yo pensé puede ser tanto como un ensayo reflexivo al respecto de lo que significa perder una lengua y todas las consecuencias al respecto de que una lengua que se pierde no se vuelve a recuperar. Y que el alumno llegue a esa reflexión al respecto de escribir un ensayo donde reflexione la pérdida de una lengua para la humanidad y todo lo que se pierde en cuanto a una cosmovisión de un pueblo, de las cosas, de las personas, del amor, de la vida, que si no se sigue transmitiendo la lengua, pues todo eso va a morir con las generaciones últimas que tengan esa lengua. Tanto puede ser a manera de un escrito de un ensayo con esta reflexión, o algo más poético como pedirles un poema al respecto de lo que es perder una lengua, pero tomando elementos de la misma cultura al respecto de escribir poemas, o sea, investigar un poco más de eso, que bueno, yo lo veo como cómo gancharse más con los miembros, de conocerlos, identificar cómo escriben, sus cosmovisiones, y sería un aprendizaje para el alumno también de una cosmovisión de la vida diferente a partir de lo que la cultura que él conoció le enseñó.
Sí, gracias, muchas gracias. So that's actually, I would suggest, maybe part of the next piece about the societal issue, because that gets really into why we're doing this work to begin with. It's about the extinction of the language. So I want to distinguish between learning about the service and learning about the societal issue. So learning about the service is learning the specific skills that students need, or the particular knowledge students need to be able to do a quality service. All right? So to be able to work with the elderly who speak Ojibwe, or to be able to collect this data in an organized way, to be able to then take those data and organize them systematically into something that's going to be meaningful for a dictionary. Those are skills in order for them to do a quality service. This learning about the societal issue is then thinking about why we do this work, the so what of the work. why are we spending this time dealing with the Ojibwe language dictionary? It's because of exactly what you were saying. And so all the things that I believe you were saying is really about the societal issue learning that students are doing, and you gave some excellent examples of that. Okay, so those are the distinctions, and this is what we miss with assessment and service learning. We tend to do the learning content and societal issue and leave out all the things the students have learned in terms of skills and knowledge to do the service, or we do the learning, content, and the skills service and not the societal issue piece. And what I'm trying to say is we need to think about all of this to really get that purple service learning sphere when we assess student learning, because students are learning in all these dimensions. And the more we can capture that, the more I think the robustness and richness of service learning can come through in terms of what it's doing for our students. Okay, so so thank you for those. So here's just some ways that we might look at the service. They can write a reflection on how they approach the student members, like Alicia was suggesting, or we can see how accurately they put this dictionary together. Right? The dictionary itself, the product, becomes a quality check on what they have learned. Right? And so the learning about the societal issue, and again, we might be able to have students think about why we do this. We could have a discussion, we could have reflection papers, we could do a lot of different things around this. So thinking about making sure we capture all areas of these learnings are what's going to be really important for us to really get the most out of the experience for our students. So learning is very important. Kind of knowledge and understanding is what this framing is really all about. But as we heard from our panelists earlier, we heard that students learn many other things and get many other things out of this. And so I want to talk about the fact that students get some civic and ethical social responsibility learning. And there are a number of tools and assessment instruments that are out there. These tend to be, and also social and personal development, as we heard, and also career development. There are lots of tools and instruments out there. These tools and instruments, though, tend to be more what I call indirect tools. So I'll give you an example of the kinds of questions that are asked on the community services scale. And by the way, I sent a copy of this to the team here, so if you'd like a copy of the scale, you're welcome to have it. But they ask how much students agree or disagree, strongly agree or strongly disagree with statements like, there are people in the community who need help. The more people who help, the better things will get. I feel an obligation to contribute to the community. It is important to help people in general. These are the kinds of questions, and students either agree or disagree. And then we might do this at the beginning and at the end of the semester, and we might see some change. And then we could say students learned and they grew and developed. But again, this is not like a rap performance where you are hearing it and seeing it yourself and students are demonstrating. This is an attitudinal scale where students are saying, yeah, I think it's important to contribute to community. Do they really think that, or are they saying that, right? And so, of course, students are going to be as honest as possible. But, you know, I mean, it's not a real demonstration. It's a more indirect. So a lot of the ways we've been measuring these things have been in a very, very indirect way. And we have to try to think about how we might actually have students present some of their understandings and growth through more direct assessments. And so for example, social and personal development, we have actually seen students have an empowerment portfolio where they one of the things that the students, and this is a different example, not the Ojibwe one, but a different example, it was about leadership and empowerment. That was the course was about leadership, and part of the experience was to empower individuals. And so what the students would do is document when they have stepped forward and took initiative on something that they were a little afraid about or unsure about, outside of their comfort zone. And they were asked to have 2 or 3 of those kinds of experiences and describe the experience and what they did, and it showed sort of that real step of empowerment and what they did and how they felt, what they reacted to, and ultimately that became part of the course assessment of students to show that they were able to really take a big leap towards an empowerment model. Right, so we're moving more towards these more direct assessments, but the majority of the assessments in these areas are very indirect, and I would say not always very satisfactory. I want to talk about just 2 things very quickly in the last few minutes that I have, and it's the so we have this framing and to look at these different formal and informal assessments across these 3 areas. Another thing to think about is the role of reflection as an assessment tool. As we know, reflection is very important in service learning, and that the reflection is a critical component of being able to link the service and the learning. And one of the, there are a number of different models to look at service learning in terms of the role of reflection in assessing the learning and service learning. And I have looked at one that I think shows a lot of promise, called the DEAL model. And this is developed by Ashton Clayton and Atkinson several years ago, and it's really about critical reflection. It's not just about the way we tend to do reflection often in service learning is, this is what I did, this is what I saw, this is what I experienced, this is how I felt. Not so much what did I learn. And what they suggest is thinking from service reflection from a critical perspective. So, and they actually have this model where they think, where they consider critical thinking standards around reflection. So how clear is the reflection? How accurate? How precise is it? How deep is it? Does it have breadth and logic and significance and fairness tied to it? And they actually have a little rubric with little questions that you can ask. And it really helps bring out more learning from reflection rather than kind of just description of the experience. Right? So it's really about getting into the learning and using reflection as a way to actually help assess student learning. So to the extent that students are able to address all of these different standards around critical reflection is a demonstration that indeed students have learned based on how they articulate their learning in that reflection process, if that makes sense. So reflection can be a mechanism to assess student learning. The last thing, as my phone rings here, the last thing is, the last thing I want to mention is that the other way we can assess student learning and service learning is through the service learning experience itself, where service learning is the assessment. And what I mean by that is that we may have experience in a classroom, content in a course. And then what we ask the students to do, the way we assess students' learning, is we have them do a service learning experience to demonstrate that they have indeed learned the content of the course, learned about the societal issue, and learned some skills. And the service learning experience and how well they can do the service learning experience demonstrates that they have develop that learning. And so I can give you a couple quick examples of what I mean by that because it's a little abstract. So one example is data analysis and statistics. You're thinking, what, statistics and service learning? Well, so let me give you this example. So this is students in a statistics course are learning to use SPSS, which is one of the statistics, you all know SPSS. And part of the course involves several sessions called Making Meaning from Data, where we have large data sets and we have to make some meaning out of it. That's the course. That's a part of the course. And the portion of the course engages students in working with local primary and secondary school districts that have collected lots of data. So these school districts collect information and data, but about students, teachers, parents, etc., but no one has time to analyze any of it. Right? So they collect data, but they don't have anyone to look at it. And so they ask these students so they give students a set of questions that they would like to have answered with the data that they have. And the students who know statistics and are taught SPSS are asked to provide analyses for these school districts. So the students spend time working with the school administrators on building an understanding of what kinds of data are available for analysis, how clean the data are. You know, there's always messy data, how valid, reliable the data are, etc. And the students then use SPSS to run those analyses, and students work in groups. They tackle different parts of the data. And for the course exam, the students were asked to interpret the findings from their analyses. So you did these analyses, now how you interpret these findings. What are you going to tell the school districts based on the data? And also explain the data in a way that can be understood by administrators. Because those of us sometimes who do research using statistics sometimes present a lot of regression tables. People going like, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? So how are you going to explain your results in a way that is understandable to those who don't know statistics or aren't familiar with SPSS and all the different tables? So rather than showing regression charts, Cohenbach alphas, all those kinds of things, each student had to do a presentation in front of the school district administrators. So some students developed some tables, some developed analogies, some developed pictures. They all did it in very different ways. And what these presentations did was to demonstrate the extent to which students really understood the data, the results, how accurate those were, demonstrate that they did it accurately, and that they could translate the information to audiences who were not necessarily experienced with statistics. And so the service learning experience became the assessment of how well the students learn statistics, how they can apply it in meaningful ways, which was the objective of the course. That makes sense? So it's about going and using service learning as a way to show that students can apply the information beyond the course. And the last example I want to give you is similarly what we do in health studies. This is in my university where students are learning, these are health, those in medical school, all our second-year medical students have to do service learning. And they have to do service learning in a community that's different from their own background. Because of the diversity in our communities, health professionals need to know how to work with different communities and individuals from different cultures. And so we have a large Muslim community in our area, and part of it is there are protocols about treating Muslim women that need to be taken into account. So the medical students are working on learning how to do this by actually being in the health clinics. But in addition, they have to do something that's going to improve the services of the health clinic. In this case, in this health clinic, all of these are community health clinics. So they're nonprofit run by community organizations. So they don't have a lot of resources. So the students go and they spend a semester working in these. And in this particular clinic, what they had in these particular clinics, all of their data were on index cards. They weren't on computers or anything. People just fill out the cards. And so what the students did was they developed a technology system where they put all the information in a database and taught those who come through the clinic, who work at the clinic, volunteer at the clinic, how to use that. Okay, so they improved the services, but they also were able to understand the different customs. So this experience became the assessment that was used in the medical school program so for students to demonstrate that they know how to treat individuals from different backgrounds and that they know how to improve healthcare systems by the project, the service learning project itself. So think about our service learning projects as a way to improve, as a way to assess what students have learned. Okay? If that makes sense. Okay, so with that, I just want to end by saying that there's no one way to assess student learning and service learning, but we need to make sure it's comprehensive in all the aspects. We do miss a lot of learning that students get, so thinking about those 3 dimensions and then thinking about how reflection done critically can be used as an assessment tool and how service learning itself can be an assessment. So with that, I say thank you very much, and I think we maybe have 1 or 2 minutes for a question if anybody has one. Muchas gracias. Thank you. ¿Preguntas, persona? Sí, gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación. Creo que nos dan muchas pistas todo lo que nos compartes.
Gracias.
La pregunta sería ¿qué papel podría tener la autoevaluación y la evaluación de pares en un modelo para hacer el assessment de service learning?
See, that's an excellent question. I think it could have a lot of value. I think I find self-assessments to be really helpful when they're done both subjectively and objectively. And so I think it's helpful when as a student, I'm doing my self-assessment as to what I think, where areas of my growth are and where areas I need to improve. But also to have that same assessment done by peers who have observed me, or the professor or the teacher who has observed me, and then compare those. And I think that, and then use that as a conversation to what it is that's really happening, because sometimes the professor may not know or may miss something, and use it as an opportunity for the student to explain, or for the student then to understand that, oh, I realize I'm farther ahead than I thought I was, right? So I think that's really helpful. I think just doing self-assessments by themselves, I think we don't get that critical analysis that's needed to really calibrate it in a way that really allows us then to use it effectively in what we need to do. So, ¿otras preguntas? Sí, gracias.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really, really nice.
Gracias.
And it gave me a different focus of what we have been working here. Even though that I think we are doing an excellent job. As you presented, you were presenting a bigger program. Like if the university has a program like you were saying about languages.
School. Oh, languages.
The students are going to pass through the program and learn something about it, but the frame of the program, it has to be bigger and it has to be continuous. Mm-hmm. Because I think our efforts has been concentrated and need to be pushed to a bigger scale. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point. You know, with the Ojibwe dictionary, there's something that it's one course. Not all students participate. Students who are in American Indian Studies or take it as an elective, this is one course that students who take it every semester contribute, right? But to your point that this is a long-term project, so the idea of the assessment processes and tools and systems and learning objectives have been cultivated and developed over time. And with courses, we only have 15 weeks, and we have to, and then we got to move on to something else. There's not always. So we just have to, I always say, less is more when it comes to this. I would say, what's the main learning objective of your course that you want the students to have? What's the main societal issue that we want students to learn about? And what's the main service learning, the learning from the service, that just one thing, and just focus on that, knowing that other things are going to happen, but start small. That's always a better idea. One more, and then I think we're at the end of time, and I know everybody's hungry, and I don't want to stand between you and your lunch.
Hola, pues muchas gracias por la charla. Y yo solo tengo una pregunta, como arriesgándome a pensar un poquito más. Digo, sé que es tarea del profesor evaluar, pero también me gustaría saber si hay como alguna estrategia que tú conozcas o alguna manera, alguna posibilidad de que también la comunidad que se está también apoyando pueda validar un poco estos aprendizajes o también apoyar en esta parte de la evaluación.
Excellent. Thank you. And that was my failure to mention that, and because I was just looking at it from one perspective. But definitely the community partners and actually peers in the classroom, student peers, can also be part of that assessment process when they can evaluate whether or not certain standards have been met or certain learning has been achieved. So community members certainly, if there's a clarity of what the objectives are, which is the precursor to all of this. So we have to have objectives of what we want to achieve for learning, and then having community partners say, yes, I saw Alicia learn this. This is how she demonstrated it. And so the community partners can definitely be part of that assessment process. Peers, other students too, can also assess each other and give examples of where the students their peers have demonstrated learning. So thank you for raising that. I'm sorry I didn't bring that up. But yes, this is not just something professors do, but community partners and others, when there are clear objectives of what the learning objectives need to be achieved. So muchas gracias. Thank you. Thank you. So I think we're at the end of our session. So thank you. Muchas gracias again for inviting me. Appreciate it. Thank you. Sí, sí, sí.